Now, Hurricane Beryl is moving through Texas after the storm already carved a path of deadly destruction through the Caribbean. The Category 1 storm made landfall about 90 minutes ago, 100 miles south of Houston.
Well, happy Friday, Baylor College of Medicine. And the first time, or actually the second time in 4 years, we've had to broadcast offsite. The first time, of course, was COVID, and the second time was the picture I'm showing you here of Hurricane Beryl, whatever, who cares. It was supposed to go to Mexico, or at least go to the Rio Grande Valley, and decided to take a right turn into Houston, unscheduled and unwanted. So it's a little bit like the airlines these days. You think you're going one place, and it turns out you end up in another. Anyway, so in the news, really exciting. There's more news from the subcommittee on COVID-19. It's hard to believe that they are working so diligently. But so far, my favorite thing was to assess blame. Who is responsible for the 6-foot rule, a really important issue. And of course, they blamed Fauci for that. But in fact, it was a CDC recommendation. And that was based on early thoughts that the transmission was from droplets. When you'd sneeze or cough, there'd be droplets. There's a pretty good amount of data on droplet size and how far they can go, 3 to 4 feet before they hit the ground. And remember, we were all doing things like wiping down surfaces, washing hands, wiping off groceries, because we thought that was the main way of transmission based on previous SARS epidemics. But it turns out it was aerosolization. And once we knew that, we probably needed to change the recommendation, or at least tell people the 6-foot rule is helpful, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing was masking and ventilation and that kind of stuff. So, we probably could have done a better job, but to blame anybody for the 6-foot rule is sort of like a waste of time, in my view. There's never been any randomized trials on distancing. This is all based on, as I mentioned, the data from droplet physics and all that kind of thing. And one other thing is, just because it wasn't exactly right, it probably was the right decision at the time. So it's better to think about these things in context. Right now, in retrospect, it doesn't look all that great, but back at the time, it made sense. And, the other big public health issue, of course, until the hurricane came, was heat. And, heat has been a real problem. We're beginning to see deaths from heat-related. The thing about mammals and people who regulate animals that regulate their temperatures, we cool by evaporation for their sweat. And if you can't sweat enough because you're either dehydrated or there's high humidity and other things like alcohol impair sweating, then it's very difficult to maintain your temperature in high heats. And so there are many things that can aggravate that. And we've had a lot of problems with people having risk from heat. And it's so bad. I always know when things are really bad, a website turns up from the government. And there's now a website called heat.gov, which shows temperatures predicted in the continental United States. And you can see there's a number of places over 100 degrees, 90 to 100 and 100, including our community. And they even came up with a heat risk, which I like to call the gambling risk, because like number one, the most extreme risk is going to Las Vegas. Now, that actually was true before there was a heat problem, but that's Vegas. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Now, there are some areas in California that are high risk, but right now, Vegas and certain communities in California are at extreme risk for heat-related deaths. And if you look internationally, actually, there's a lot of heat-related deaths, particularly in Europe. Italy leading the way. I remember I was in Sicily last year when it was over 109 degrees, and I can tell you it's hot and it's difficult to manage. But Spain, Portugal, those countries are having problems, and we're not as bad as them. We're below, as you can see, the United Kingdom and other countries, but we are beginning to see heat-related deaths. Let's move on to the other scourge, West Nile. West Nile is rearing its head this summer. Those are the number of reported cases in the various states. You can see Arizona, Kansas, Arkansas, 1 in Mississippi, 2 in Tennessee, 1 in Michigan, and 1 in Maryland. But there is 1 in Houston. I'm not sure why the CDC didn't report it, but there was a case reported in Houston. And our friends at TEPI, the Texas Epidemic Public Health Institute, are following all wastewater viruses. And as I mentioned before, enterovirus 68 and parainfluenza are up. I took a trip. I was going to Africa last week and I got sick right at the end of the trip, just like our viewer. And I'm pretty sure it was probably parainfluenza, mostly just a severe cold that I got over. But the new one that's popped up is echovirus 11. And that is another RNA virus that it tends to be more of a risk for newborn children. They acquire it from their mothers and it can cause serious liver disease at the time of delivery. So that one is cropped up and is a risk. And as you can see, we're beginning to get a signal for SARS going up as well. And we're continuing to monitor H5N1, the bird flu. Right now, the CDC has been following more than 690 people who have potential exposure to the virus. Of the 51 who've actually been tested, only 3 have been diagnosed with H5N1, all from dairy cattle, 1 in Texas that I mentioned before, and 2 in Michigan. The CDC is now supporting a lot more activity around seroprevalence to see the pandemic potential. And the CD announced 3 key scientific objectives for H5N1. One is to really monitor people for infection and illness, for people who are exposed, mostly through the dairy industry right now. There's some science going on around understanding human infection and H5N1 illness and to prepare for a potential pandemic. And other government agencies are jumping in as well. The NIH is focusing mostly on the biology of the virus and pathogenesis. And the FDA is continuing to expand product testing for testing and also increasing testing in cattle and making sure we have a potential virus response or a vaccine response. So let's get to COVID-19, our favorite topic of 4 years. It's still a global problem, but then if you look worldwide, the number of cases have decreased. Both hospitalization and admissions are decreasing worldwide. And in April, the number of deaths decreased by 45%, with only 2,600 new fatalities reported worldwide. Now that is good, but if you think about the impact of COVID-19, there have been over 775 million confirmed cases. I'm sure there's been many more unconfirmed cases, but with the population of Earth being 8 billion, that's 10% of the entire Earth's population known to be infected, and it was probably way more than that. If you look at the 7 million deaths that have been reported globally, the case fatality based on the 775 million confirmed cases would be 1%. But because there's probably 3 or 4 times more cases than have actually been confirmed, my guess is the case fatality is closer to 0.4 or 0.2%. That's Lily. Anyway, in April, if you look at what's being presented globally, or what's presenting globally in terms of the variants of interest, JN1 continues to be the most reported variant, 130 countries, and accounted for 54% of the sequences in week 17. And it's beginning to decline, and I'll show you why. This is the traveler data I've just explained before, collected from planes that arrive in airports. And you can see that there is an increase in the number of positive samples for COVID-19. And before we go through the which are the variants, I thought I'd remind you how these are all related. So if you recall, Omicron sort of became the dominant variant in 2022. It was interesting in that it emerged from South Africa and was interesting because it had 30 mutations, and it was assumed that a person had been infected for a long period of time and accumulated all these mutations until it could jump in and be a dominant strain worldwide. The next new strain was BA.2.86. We talked about that before. It was isolated in Denmark. And the reason everyone was worried about that is, like Omicron, it had over 30 mutations, but it didn't really become very transmitted. It was recognized in many countries, but it didn't become the dominant strain until there was one additional mutation in the spike protein, the JN1, and that became the dominant strain for 2023. So if you look back when we developed the booster and now the current vaccine, it was to XBB 1.5, which is a related strain to Omicron, but had branched off from the BA.2.6 and JN1 strain. So it's a close enough one that it's effective, but it's not a perfect match. And then what's happened since 2024 is there's been 4 additional mutations, and that has been, we're calling those the flirt mutation, where the phenylalanine to leucine and an arginine to threonine and the spike protein leads to these KP2 and KP3, and they are the sort of dominant species right now. So let's look at what's floating around in the wastewater from planes, that is coming from Europe and other countries. You can see that it was mostly in June was JN1. You can see dominated through February, March, April. That's the purple. And then by June, KP2 and KP3, or the flirt variants, became sort of the dominant species. So what's happening in the United States? This is the national wastewater data. We're beginning to see an uptick. We unlike the rest of the world's going down, the U.S. is going up a little. Mostly, if you look at emergency room visits, that's the leading indicator. There's a spike in those over 75 and those over 65. And so if you look at some of the lagging indicators like hospitalizations and deaths, they are lagging behind. But the early indicators like test positivity and emergency room visits are increasing. And what is the species, the variants? Mostly KP2, KP3. And you can see JN1 disappeared pretty quickly in May and June, which is why I personally think that these 2 variants, the flirt variants, probably originated in the United States, because we're sort of seeing those in advance of the data coming from travelers entering the country. They were about a month behind us, and I think probably these emerged in the U.S. Now, good news is that we, Baylor, are sponsoring the new vaccine trial on a nasal vaccine. One of the things we've talked about is the current vaccines, prevent serious infection and hospitalization, but they don't prevent just infection in milder forms of the disease. And so that's probably due to the fact that when you get an injection, you develop an IgG response, which is what prevents you from getting virus or fights virus in the bloodstream. But in fact, when it enters through the nasal mucosa in your upper respiratory area, which is really IgA mediated. And so a nasal form of the vaccine, at least in theory, would have a better prevention of infection in milder disease. We are the lead site, and Emory and NYU are our co-leads. And so we are looking at a nasal version of this vaccine. Hopefully will be effective, and we'll know more fairly soon. The current vaccine recommendations for COVID and flu by the CDC is that everyone 6 months of age should receive an updated COVID-19 vaccine. That's the XBB 1.5 currently. Also, an updated influenza vaccine will be ready in the fall. And why should we be doing this? Well, if you look the past season, adults age 65 and older were basically 82% of all in hospital deaths, mostly due to upper respiratory infections. So this is really important that we vaccinate the at-risk group. Last week, the FDA met to talk about vaccines for COVID and decided that the JN1 lineage is the virus, but the FDA recently advised vaccine makers to be even more specific and try and get the flirt variant. So I'm not sure which will appear, whether it'll be JN1 or the flirt variants. I hope it's more the flirt variants because those are the dominant species currently, but we'll just have to wait and see. There are going to be vaccines from all the 3 manufacturers that we talked about, and they've already decided next year that the influenza vaccine will again be a trivalent of H5NI and the B Victoria lineage. Remember, Yamagata strain didn't appear, but they're adding H3N2, which did appear this year as an influenza A virus. Not very dominant, but a fair number of cases. So I want to end today with shout outs. As you know, the Houston area experienced a very, very big weather event. It was a serious hurricane. We didn't really expect it, mostly a wind event, but a lot of homes were damaged. Hurricane Beryl forced our main campus to close on Monday. We don't usually do this because there's so many people who depend on our clinical care as well as our researchers that need to have their labs going. So we were sad to do it, but we had to do it. Our safety is the major issue, so we did close the campus on Monday. And it's not just a little thing, because during that storm, we have a lot of people who have to come on and stay there overnight. And that includes people who manage the facilities, our environmental safety, all the animal care folks, all the animals need to be cared for overnight, our security and our communications people. Every time we have a major emergency like this, they never hesitate. They all come, stayed overnight. We have a ride-out team, and I want to give a big shout out to all of you who were able to contribute by coming in and staying overnight, but also those of you who were able to contribute at home. So also, we're a very resilient community here in Houston, and I want to thank the healthcare workers that stayed in the hospitals, all the people out there working to reestablish power to the 2 million people who lost it. We are a resilient city, but it was a really tough storm. So thanks to everybody. Anyway, have a wonderful weekend, and I can't wait to see you next week.